Hello and welcome to a discussion of a book that is it a horror book? We'll probably get into that, but it is definitely a book called Blackwater by um, actually what is his name? Michael
Michael
McDowell.
McDowell.
Michael McDowell. So I'm holding up what is book two in the series. As you can see, I have these have lovely covers in the UK, and Jane has what can only be described as a murder weapon. Because this is a story that is 6 volumes, I believe.
Yeah, I think
It's
it's
broken
six.
into
Yeah, I think
six.
yeah.
But we're only doing part one or book one, which is called The Flood.
hmm
And like I say, I'm Jane, joined by my good friend Lady Jane from Lady Jane Books. How are you doing, Jane?
Good, Chris. It has been way too long. Like I have been a little MIA, so I could not help but come back to talk about this with you. This has been such a great like segue back into spooky season,
Mm,
summerween, and so I'm really excited about this. I think this is going to be a good discussion.
yeah, it's one of those. As somebody who has a tendency to go MIA on their friends, etc., I mean, I am in no position to say anything other than that I understand.
Good, thank you.
Sometimes it's just necessary. My friends say there are just times of the year where they say I go dark, and I went that's pretty apt. But sometimes it's needed. But good to have a discussion back with you. The last one we did was
The
what was it?
Shining, The Shining
Was that
from
was that
Jim
the last
Barry.
one we did? Was the
That was
Shining
the
episode?
last one we
The
did.
one in
Yeah,
between?
isn't it?
Right. Okay. So I
It
was thinking that's
it feels
crazy.
like a long time ago, but then it doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's strange, like time warp with it. So
Yeah,
with
it's like, what the hell?
2026.
I was thinking there must have been something in between, but it's funny because somebody was speaking the other day about the difference between the book and the movie, etc. And because we'd done the discussion, I was like, well, actually, this is a real thing. So, yeah.
I'm the
It
expert
was
on
good.
this.
Yeah, well, it's, expert might be strong, but at least I have strong opinions.
Fair enough.
That's nice. So, yes, we're going to talk about book one here, which is called The Flood, as we say, of this book that was written and published in around 1970 something. And is received a revival over the last couple of years, especially in the UK. Anyway, that probably coincides with these uh, kind of reprints that we've seen there. And I had seen it in my local bookshops and a lot of local bookshops around here for a while, thinking it was a new release. Because I think, in essence, it's the books are of the length of like pulp novels, of pulp fiction
hmm
novels. You know, they're not quite novellas, but they're slightly more than that. But they would sort of give off that idea, and you could think this was sort of pulp horror in some ways, which we'll get to.
Definitely.
Um, I will say off the top of the bat, it wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. I
Not
think you get
yet.
into that, not into that. Yes,
Not
exactly.
yet. I
But
think it's eerie, but I don't think it's scary. But
absolutely
I think he's kind of like building to like
to a
a
point.
scarier like type of thing. But also like and this is kind of an interesting book because it really is a classic Southern Gothic, which
Hmm.
you don't see a lot in the horror genre. It's a very like specific niche. And I will say though, it does really sink into that genre with kind of like it's not necessarily supposed to be scary because gothics are supposed to be a little bit more ominous
Ominous. Yeah,
ominous
yeah,
um and so I do think it may not be like scary in the way that we like The Shining scary, but I do think it is really a true representation of a gothic tale, and
yeah.
sometimes those can be intertwined, but I think this one is very specifically gothic rather than like horror personally.
Yeah. And I suppose it fits quite well because we've done obviously a lot of discussions about Hitchcock, who does suspense rather than horror or thrillers and that kind of stuff. And he talks about the fact that the promise of something happening is often much more effective than
Yes.
actually something happening. And so that ominous feeling that you get off this book, you're sort of waiting for the shoe to drop. And
Yeah,
especially around
exactly.
our main character that we have to start, which I'm sure we'll get into. But what did you like it?
I did. So well, in all transparency, I did start this book about 3 times, and which is kind of embarrassing to say with it being so short. I think it's
Short.
only like
Yeah.
135 pages or something like that. But I do see how it is a much slower novel, and that's kind of why I think it's more of a gothic than a horror, because I was. It does really go into like the decay of what's going on in the setting in Perdido, Alabama. And it really like talks about like the destruction of the flood. And so that takes up a lot of time at the beginning. And for me, that was a little slower. And the introduction of the characters was a little slower. So in all honesty, I put it on hold for a little while because it wasn't capturing my attention at the time. And then I tried to restart it two more times after that. And I just wasn't in the right like headspace for it at that time. But then over time, I did chip away at it. And then by the time I finished it, I'm like, well, I need to know what happens next. And I'm very invested in the story now. So I do think once it gets past a certain point, I liked it a lot better.
Mhm.
But I do think for me, like it was a very slow build up. So I'm glad that I got past that. But so I did like it, but I had to wait a little bit to really like it. How about
Yeah,
you?
I mean that makes complete sense because to me this book is all vibes, or this volume of
Yes.
it is all vibes, and I think like the fact that you were reading it, but it wasn't kind of seeping under the skin, to use the
Yeah.
sort of metaphor that this does in the flood, etc. You would know to stop reading it and kind of going, I'm just my brain's not in the place to receive that right now. So actually, that
Yeah.
stop start um, way that you handle it actually is the right way to do it, because it is I don't think there's a massive amount of plot that happens in this book. In fact, it's very reminiscent of many other books at this stage at the start, once you take the start of it away. But once you get into the sort of family drama, it's very reminiscent of lots of things that I've read, including things like even Pet Cemetery that we've talked about. I
Yeah,
mean, the neighbors and
very
the
much so.
judgment of the mirrors, all the stuff, you can definitely draw parallels across from that, that when you go to look at it. But I was sort of I'd read the first 50 pages and then stopped because you were saying, "Oh, I'd probably take a bit of time," and I was like, "That's absolutely fine, absolutely." So I started it again and then just did it in one sit, and I just couldn't stop reading it. It was one of those things. I just found it really eerie from the start. You know, that kind of setting, and then wanting to know or waiting for the shoe to drop. A bit like we're
Yeah.
saying about that ominous kind of thing. You can feel the pervasive evilness of the story kind of wading along, and then the obliviousness of everybody around it. Again, very reminiscent of King in an awful lot of ways as well. It has
Yeah.
that very small town feel of
Yeah.
like things are happening in this town, and nobody's really paying attention to how things are changing ever so slowly, etc. Like it's very Salem's Lot that again we've discussed. Again, I could feel an awful lot of the the beats of that with the furniture shop, and then with our main character here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think for myself, like, there are family dynamics in this, and that's pretty central to the entire story. But
Mhm.
for me, being introduced to that many characters and that length of time, I kept on getting confused of, okay, well, who's this and which person is she going to marry? And then like I was kept getting like them a little bit confused. And so I think that also for me caused me to be like, okay, I'm not in the right headspace because I can't decipher this. And so, but now again that I've gone past it, it is so much drama. And I love
Mhm.
like a drama story. You know what I mean? I love like a family drama. I love like interpersonal like conflict and stuff like that. So now that it's delved more into that, now I'm like, okay, I'm very invested. I need to see what goes on between these characters and who comes out on top. And yeah, so I do. So now that I've read the whole thing, I can appreciate it way more.
Yeah, and I think one other thing I'll say before we start dipping into plot, there are a couple of big themes I think that jump out at this. I think one of the interesting ones for me, and it often tends to be interesting for me because, again, I'm when I read books, I kind of think of them as empathy machines, and I kind of trying to see a perspective that I don't really have. So the likes of Oscar and James in the story, I can sort of relate to what they're thinking. But I think this book especially is around two matriarchs in
Yeah.
their own way, even though it's the battle of good versus evil, what it feels like in the face of it between the ultimate good and the ultimate bad. This seems to be there, even though neither of them have really shown their hand. It's just sort of subtext in the writing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And a little bit of both in each, which is kind of
Yes.
interesting too.
Yeah.
So it's like you don't really know who to root for at the time. So
Yeah.
I think it's
Because if
very
you
interesting. Go ahead.
if you were to judge actions, you would think that it might be the other way around at this stage. But because of the way it's presented in that Southern Gothic style, as you sort of say, you sort of whether it's our knowledge of these types of stories from read beforehand or films that we've seen that in this style, you sort of know the direction of travel that's going here, and the author leaves plenty of clues. You know, sometimes it's just things not being where they should be, or people being left to do tasks and jobs that we'll get to, etc. But we'll start there actually with the idea of the whole book starts with a flood.
A
They're basically
flood.
in a flood, and the water's risen up very high to the heights of the windows and upper floor things. So a couple of floors have been disappeared under the water as it is, and we have two people that are going around the boat just trying to see if they can help any survivors there, and they come across this woman that I think it's fair to say they're both taken by physically how striking she is. She's bright
Yes.
red hair, that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. She's somebody that stands out in and amongst all of the dreariness, say, of the flood and
Oh yeah.
the wreck and ruin and despair of it. And so they're drawn to save her with very noble intentions, I think, to say at the
Oh
start.
yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting that we do start out with like these descriptions of like there are like dead pigs in the water and things like that, and like or raccoons or roosters or whatever animal, and you kind of get this idea of being there just after a catastrophe
Mhm.
and seeing like the absolute destruction and detritus and all of that kind of nastiness that they're all going to have to deal with very, very soon. And they're kind of all in shock of just the magnitude of the destruction. And I think that's kind of interesting because we're starting in at a place of vulnerability for these people. Like they know they don't know the destruction of their business yet. They
Mhm.
don't know, if their homes have like survived. They don't know if their like heirlooms have survived. Um, and they know that the catastrophes happened, but they're just in that moment before being able to go into like damage mode type of
Mhm.
thing. So I think that's kind of an interesting place to start because it does show that this whole community is at a time of vulnerability and these characters are a time of vulnerability. And I think it's interesting that that's exactly when we meet Eleanor, and she
Mhm.
just kind of happens to just appear here like in the midst of that moment. So I think that was really clever of the author to do that. That right now is kind of setting us off that something's not right. Like why is this character showing up right now after a disaster?
Yeah. And I think to
Mhm.
add to that, I mean, we probably don't get a sense of this until a bit further on the book, but it also is at a time and interface where we're kind of going into a modern age, if you know
Yeah.
what I mean. So you
Mhm.
definitely get, this idea that there's a central family that runs the entire town and has control of the town, and you can see why they kind of think they're okay all the time. They have land, they have ways, they have means, they have relationships within it, and she is somebody to them that represents new, but she's actually probably old in some
Mm,
ways. And I think I really like that kind of feeling of like she is the new temptress, the new scene in town, the person that's going to shake it up. But her roots seem to be based in mythology
yeah.
and
Yeah.
in the past.
It's almost like a representation of hubris a little bit.
Mhm.
That's how I took it, that she's like, "Oh, you think you're so powerful? Well, I control the water, not to spoil it, but like I can control water, like." And I think that's kind of interesting too, to start with the flood and then not to spoil it, but we do see like Eleanor being able to manipulate water and
Yeah.
all this type of things. And you know I just think that's kind of interesting that even like you have all these like man-made empires, it is being destroyed by a flood, destroyed by nature. So even though like you think you're kind of invincible, like nature could destroy you if she wills it. And I think that's kind of the eeriness that we get right in
Mhm.
this scene. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think
And
that's quite interesting.
yeah, oh, and very much so. And the fact that this water has destroyed everything that man has built around
Yes.
there, like you say, nature is destroyed around it because they're basically in a swamp. And they're also, the buildings are made of wood, it's kind of rotting, everything's sort of on a downbeat. And they haven't got to the stage where they're thinking about building a levee to stop this happening in the future. They're kind of in the middle between there, and there are obviously issues that come up around that. But then out steps Eleanor to be saved, this damsel in distress in some ways, and yet even from the very first moment, I think she appears in the page, she appears to have a calmness and a control to
Yeah, like
say that
cool as
she
a
is not.
cucumber type of thing.
Yes,
Like,
absolutely. But
yeah.
no, for somebody that was trapped inside, now they make observations about her clothes and about what the water level is, and just generally about where how she would have got there into the room, etc. They have their own questions, but they're sort of putting those to the side to kind of say, "Oh, that's probably not important. This woman needs help," and you know, she's an attractive woman. She's somebody that carries a persona and an aura about them, and they do the very much. Oh, I'll get your bags. Oh, I'll go back and get your other bag, and not find it or otherwise. And I, I actually really like that scene at the start where he goes back to get the bag and can't find it by himself because again it sets up this kind of sense of dread that these two men came to pick her up and save her, but she's been able to split them up almost immediately,
Mhm.
and sort of exert control on them almost immediately, even though the situation is dangerous.
Yeah. And there's two things. I think the fact that she's like this young, pretty woman, like really plays into that too. Like from the
Yes.
start, we see like the rules are not going to apply to her, like no one's going to ask any questions. Um, but and I think that's quite interesting as we go through the story too. But also think that it's interesting that Bray Sugarwhite, who I think works for Oscar
Hmm.
Kasky, he kind of automatically has like the sense up that something's not right. Like we shouldn't go in there. Like at every turn, he's like, I want to go home. Like I don't want to be in this boat anymore. We shouldn't look at this window. We should not
Hmm.
pick up this woman. I am not going getting your bags. Like at every stop, he's the one kind of like with this common sense, which I think is interesting.
But intuition, really,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's
Yeah,
this kind of
that's
forbidden
the right
sense.
word. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that it's him versus someone like Oscar. And, we do see an economic and social gap there. And I think what you were saying about playing into like their industry and the man-made and that they are a wealthy family, that's an interesting dynamic that Bray was the one to say something's not right here. But then Oscar just cannot imagine. All he sees is a pretty damsel in distress.
Yeah, but
So,
Bray has grown up in a world that isn't privileged. In
yeah,
some way, it's
exactly.
not.
That's
So
exactly what I was getting to. So
yeah,
like,
so he is always on the lookout for self-preservation, whereas Oscar, you said it earlier, they're hubris of that family just in general to say they're untouchable, even within. These are problems, but they're problems that they can overcome through money and influence and all of those other things. That they have ways and means that they'll not be destroyed by this. Whereas Bray is an employee, draws a wage, he wants to get back to his family or whatever else there is
yeah.
going. So he always be on the lookout to think about, God, is that a risk that happening, etc. So it's a really interesting setup, I think, at the start because on one hand you have the descriptions of the swamp essentially that they're in, and then you have the descriptions of those people at the start that they're together but they are different, and then about how Elner kind of rises up out of the swamp essentially,
Yeah.
and kind of starts to exert her control almost immediately.
Yeah, I agree. But I just think that's so interesting that he's the one being like, nope, like no, no, absolutely not, no. And even despite these protests, like he's kind of sidestepped a little bit. Like, well, like she needs help. Like he's the one kind of like the voice of reason in this
Yeah,
situation. Um, so I just think that was so interesting that he probably sees like all of this like playing out already. And I thought that was so interesting, like as a foil to Oscar there in that scene.
yeah. So we move on to the end. I mean, jump forward a little bit, but she starts to integrate herself into their society a little bit, and a lot of the story just centers around this Kasky family unit that essentially is two houses side by side, but that kind of are offshoots of the one house, and you have the the main matriarch, which would be Mary Love Kasky, that is sort of cares for everybody. I think within the town is the classic matriarch of a
Yep.
small town village, etc. In some ways, and then the offshoot of that, which is the father and daughter that seem to
Hmm.
be by
James.
themselves
Yep.
and
James and Grace.
lacking, yeah, and lacking a woman in the house. There is a wife on the scene, but she disappears off and has. I mean, we don't know her at the start of things, so all of the things that were described about her are by people's observations of her. Some people will talk her down immediately. Some people will try and say, "Oh, it's just because," as you would classically expect. But she finds a place to insert herself into that is still a very uh, natural female role within society. So
Hmm.
that's how she's able to insert herself.
Hmm. You mean as a teacher?
Well, a teacher and also as the proxy mother
Oh yes, that's right.
for
That's right. Yes,
yeah. So
that's right.
yes, but yeah, both are roles. She talks her way into being a teacher, an area of responsibility that people will look after, etc., or look up to,
Hmm.
but also into this kind of wife and mother role, even though
Hmm.
she's neither at the start, but
Right.
she starts to exert herself in that way as a way to get into that community and that family.
Right. And I think it's interesting because again, she is like I think she's like a young, beautiful woman. So these are easier for her to do.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
I kind of think that like if you swap genders and you saw like, a gentleman come out of the water and just being like, "Hey, I want to like be a teacher and live with this," it's going to be a different perception socially within this book. So,
Hmm.
but I do think because of her gender and the way she looks, people are more apt to not ask questions. And talking back, like, going back to what you were saying about like there are a lot of things kind of like swept under the rug or just kind of dismissed. And so I think that's how she's able to do it because she's able to kind of look the part. Versus if this was like anybody else, I don't think we would be getting as warm a reception in
Hmm.
this close knit town as she got.
Yeah.
So I think that
No,
was interesting too.
yeah, that's a really great observation because it does stay true with society as we know it. This idea that beauty does open doors for you and does create a smoother path for you
Yeah.
compared to some others. As you say, if that had been a male, even a very attractive male,
Yeah.
it I
It's
think
not the
people would have
same
been.
in the
Yeah, it's not
book.
the same. Yeah, yeah, and it's not the same. I think in society because I don't think women swoon after a pretty man in the same way that men kind of fall at their feet to a pretty woman. I could be wrong about that, but that's just my observation. Men do very stupid things very quickly for pretty women in my experience, often to their own detriment and knowingly so. Although to all intents and purposes, Eleanor is a good person. She
She
takes
is.
on uh, a positive role within that society, whether that is being a teacher to local kids, but especially as this proxy mother
Yeah.
to this young girl who's lacking a mother, and a man, James, who seems like a very good man. He seems like a very God fearing, all very classic um, man at the side, just trying to do his bit and kind of make his way through life and bring up a young independent girl. But cleverly, I think, from a writing point of view, it's very much about the attachment of the girl to Eleanor
Mhm.
that draws the reader in and draws the community in to say about her virtues.
Yeah, I agree. And because she's fulfilling that role that people see as like innately good, like a motherhood role is supposed to be innately good. Um, but then like it's interesting because us as readers, again, we're privy to some like kind of dread-inducing background information. That for us too says like, okay, but something might not be quite right here. You know what I mean? Like she may be not who she seems. So I think that's kind of interesting too, that way that she's able to go in and pick up that role and it not be like socially awkward at all,
Mhm.
because there would I mean, and we do get a little bit of this I think through Mary Love's perception of like it's not decent if you have a wife to have like somebody else, but to everybody else it's perfectly natural, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So it's interesting. I think that dynamic's very interesting as well.
yeah,
But
very
I
much.
also see that, like we were talking about the flood being a moment of vulnerability, James actually would be in a very vulnerable position himself too.
Yeah,
Like socially, like it's kind of seen that maybe his wife struggled with like alcoholism or something and she's away. So there's kind of this inference that she might be like dallying with other people or something. She's away for a long time. She's not seen as a good mother. And socially, unfortunately, at the time and in the setting, that could reflect on James.
yeah.
So he actually is in a position of vulnerability socially where it's like, well, that's your wife, and that's a social shame at the time in the book. So again, who does Eleanor pick to insert herself and appear right at a great time? A person who has vulnerability. So I think that's quite interesting as well that she picked
and
that family.
and yet she doesn't. Her relationship to him is not one of, at least initially, one of displacing the wife, if you know what I mean. It's
No,
there's a supporting role, which I think's interesting because I think it could have been, and if it was written like so, I think there might have been a judgment, a negative judgment of Eleanor in that case, and I think the author's very careful not to make that kind of assumption for you,
no,
and because obviously, I mean, I don't know what happens going forward, but I feel like everything's going to shift here at a certain point. So it doesn't make sense to have Eleanor be the baddie for six smaller short stories, have a progression of that, and play and toy with the readers a little bit. And in much the same way, Mary Love's character, she is seen by the reader, and I think by an awful lot of times being obstructionist and have not really having uh, a role or a real reason for disliking Eleanor in the way that she does the distrust. But again, it's that intuition that she has. It is that idea that she has that something's just not quite right here. For all of the reasons that we talked about, how she appeared, how she got the job, the way people fawn over her. And part of that can be ascribed to the fact that she's being displaced a little bit. So there is that element to it. And I think the reader certainly feels that is part of the justification for it, for that happening. But also there's something on a more kind of base level or maternal level that she's going, something's not quite right.
Yeah, and the protectiveness she has over especially the male members of her family.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Absolutely. Yeah. So things seem to be going kind of okay. There's some other stuff about, the building of the levy and the council and that kind of stuff that obviously Eleanor's very against. Again, setting this sort of ominous tone.
Yeah, like why? Why aren't you against like protecting our town here? And that's yeah.
So controlling the water, controlling the flow of her lifeblood, it seems, because she's very comfortable in the water. All of the dangerous parts of the water, she's like, I'll be fine traveling to and from school and that kind of stuff. She's like, oh, it's fine. But then we get a reminder of the evil that lurks. Probably we get our first real sense of it with the murder. I don't think there's any other way to do it. It's kind of written a bit different than that, but
yeah, and I think I think this is interesting too because we had just talked about how she's very like almost motherly to Grace, which is the little girl, right? And that's how she got into this town and like she's such a great figure and but then we turn around and I perceive that this young boy is almost the same as Grace's age. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. And he's gone without a trace. And the inference is because of Eleanor. And so that's kind of interesting too. That's why I personally don't, I see this as a manipulation thing rather than being like a really good person for Grace, because now we see like she doesn't actually really care. You know what I mean? Like, so you don't know. That's the thing. You don't know if she actually does truly care for Grace and James, or is this just a way to keep up appearances because we see what she's done with another child. So that's again us, we don't really know what's going on here and who Eleanor is and what's her plan here.
And also because she sort of befriends that child for a while, is seen as non-threatening to that child, so that he gets let in. The nature and the reason for the murder is still, if it is a murder, I mean, because a lot of it's just very suggested in it, but is it because she needs to feed? Is it because she needs to do something like that? Or is it a way to center herself? Or is there some, was that child a threat to her plans in some way? And might have been, and as it goes. But a really interesting moment, because it's the one part of the book until we get to the end with the wife where we're sort of coming around the idea, well, maybe Eleanor is fine. Maybe she's good. Despite our base notions of what direction the way she was found, except at the start, there was no evidence really that there was something amiss. Really, she's just doing good things. And Mary loves being a bit harsh, like, okay, she's nobody coming in town, but look at all the good she's doing. She's pride and comfort and a role in that family, and a good a good place for Grace to grow up in, in a more solid family unit.
Which is kind of interesting because then we almost become a character in this too, because that's
Mm,
exactly
that's
what's
true.
happening with all the characters, and we as a reader, like we can't. It's happening to us as well. So
Well, we're the townspeople, aren't we? We are from the outside looking in, kind of making judgments on this family that run and go. We are the people with the pitchforks in one scenario, and the people, kind of casting the votes in another in the town council. So it is interesting about how we take on this kind of nameless avatar within
yeah,
the story
yeah.
um, as it goes along. Really nice, really lovely point. Um, so I mean, we get an awful lot of back and forward then between Mary Love, Eleanor, this kind of head to head. Why don't you trust her? All of that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
While
Yep.
Oscar is completely besotted with her, and James has got the sort of father role. But then the wife comes back,
Hmm. How
and
interesting.
I think the you could just feel somebody has just turned up the heat a little bit. Again, this in this swamp, we're in Alabama. Somebody just turned up the heat a few degrees just to see what way everything would react and go, and
Mhm.
especially in terms of Grace, because although her mother doesn't seem like a very good person at all, still the child's mother, and there will be natural kind of
Yeah,
relationships there that she needs to
yeah,
break through, and she is, regardless of what Eleanor's intentions are, she is a threat to Eleanor's place in that society. And
yes.
if the wife comes back or otherwise, then she's on the out from that relationship, and all the time and effort just put into it.
Although at that time, wasn't she married to Oscar though?
Yes, she was. She was. So they get married, but I, to me, if okay, I'll put it this way: if she was just married to Oscar, the rich guy in town, right, she would just be the pretty girl to get married to the guy with the loads of money, right? She
Mhm,
doesn't carry the sympathies of people that are around the town. To
mhm.
me, it's her relationship with Grace
Oh,
that
I
ties
see.
her
I
in
see what you're
terms in a
saying. Yeah,
positive light, if that makes sense. If if
yeah,
if Grace and James weren't in the picture, like you're saying, there's a vulnerability in James as well, that she fits in. Now, this could be just from a narrative point of view, that she fits a positive view in the reader's eye
I
in
see.
terms of having that. If she's just the pretty new wife, she could just be marrying for money. I mean, that there's nothing really to stop her for that. In fact, I don't think there's any real indication in the writing that she's besotted with Oscar in the same way that he is with her, if you know what I mean. So,
Yeah.
it's not written like that. So to me, the reader's sympathies tie in this relationship to Grace.
I see. I see. Okay. That makes more sense. I was thinking more of like she would be like turned out of the house or type of thing, or like, so that's why I was like, no, because she's married. So like now
Well,
I
she's
understand what you mean.
they're
Yeah.
waiting on the house getting built, etc., and then moving in, which isn't you know never going to happen, so to speak.
No,
And
no.
again, even Eleanor's patience with that is interesting.
Yeah.
I
Very
think you
much
would
so.
expect her to exert her influence, but she doesn't, knowing that she doesn't really want to push that button yet, or whatever her plan or reasons are for coming back. She's not really. It's not the time. Time is not right, and that's not the hill you want to die on.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I think it's interesting because we are seeing these two forces between Mary Love and Eleanor as well. And that I think is kind of the central
Mhm.
um, stick of this story is that who's gonna win, like who's manipulating who, like these social like battles that they're doing, which I think is quite interesting. And of course, like the conflict with the house all stems from that as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
So we have a situation where the wife is back in the scene, and the wife is a threat to Eleanor's position here. And so when the inevitable
Mm.
happens and the wife's going to leave again,
Mhm.
Eleanor has to ensure that this doesn't reoccur again in the future. This isn't just something that will reappear in another 6 months or a year, that this woman comes back and sort of
Yeah.
takes charge of the situation, and creates a very, more than ominous, a very kind of threatening end of the book, which is where
Yeah.
I think you get to and you're reading and you're going, I need to read on. I need to find
Yeah,
out what
that's
this is going,
exactly it.
because
That's yeah. Yeah.
yeah, we've been waiting on this for most of the book at this stage. This kind of this hammer to drop to say, oh, this person's showing who they really are at this stage, or exerting themselves, oh, influence over the town in ways that we knew all along she could.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was this
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. She hadn't really shown the signs. And the interesting thing, I think, in a narrative way and telling the story, is she takes other people out as collateral damage as well. You know,
Yes.
she's not
Yes.
bothered about the fact that, because I think there were ways in the story which she could have got rid of her and not killed other people that were in the thing, because, you know, well, there's any amount of ways that she could have done it, but she creates a scenario whereby she kills multiple people and takes
Wait,
them out by use of the water and the rain.
which one again? I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the car in the
The car,
loft.
yes, yeah, yeah. So the driver and her. Then she get driven along in the
Oh
car, and
no, I thought Bray drove her, and then the girl was in the back, and I thought that they survived, which that was another like I mean I could be wrong. I could be wrong. But that was
oh, it's a
my
while since I've read it. But in my head, I had it stored away. No, I could be wrong. There you go.
maybe
Isn't it funny
I
how
don't know
memory messes with you?
because I remember like I think there was saying like her head was in the back seat like with the little girl or something like that, and you got the impression that that freaked out. I could be wrong. I could have misread that.
Well, that'll be
But
interesting. That'll be interesting for me to go back and read, because
yeah,
I had sort of
because
described it as her callousness. That's what really
yeah,
what I was thinking about.
but then that's kind of interesting too because in this accident, if she's the only one to pass away,
Hmm.
that's another like something's wrong. Like why didn't anyone else pass away? You know what I
Well,
mean? So
it also says that there's a level of control where she doesn't even need to be anywhere near the incident. You know, she is
yeah,
that kind of power. I mean, this storm that seems to follow
yeah.
them directly,
It's like that
regardless.
one cloud. It's
Yeah,
on a
yeah,
bright sunny day. It's very bizarre.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, that eeriness and that ominousness has turned up and resulted in an event to finish this story, and all the while knowing that actually the bigger threat to Eleanor is the levee. If the levee gets built, then it's going to impact her ability to move through the town and impact the flow of water and all of that kind of stuff. And we've got to think that that's the end game, really. Although the second book is called The Levee.
Mhm.
Uh,
To go back a little bit though too,
yes, sorry.
with I think her name is Genevieve. I think
Yeah,
the
yeah,
wife's name, yeah, Genevieve. Um, I also think it's kind of interesting because we kind of get this set up where the author kind of says like, you know, for all of Genevieve's like reputation, like we didn't see anything like necessarily bad. Like some people believe it, some people won't, and she doesn't like to do anything. And I think the inference is that like her worst thing is that she drank,
yeah.
and like and that's not okay for a woman to do at that time. Like it's one thing for like the businessmen to drink and like you know look over their business and like go to the lumber yards and like you know have a
Mhm.
cold one or whatever, but it's bad because it was her.
Yeah,
And I think it's kind of interesting because we're kind of set up to be like, well, is she really a threat? Like is that just like a social like ostracization because you know the other women don't like her? um but then we see what happened with Grace. And that's kind of the tipping point. But I think that's that dynamic where we're kind of set up to wonder, and then we get a very clear, like, no, like she's not a good character.
yeah,
I think that's interesting because it kind of plays into what Eleanor does to us. Like, is she like actually a threat? Or and then we see like she murdered a child and you know she's you know beheading a woman in a car like yeah she's a threat but like again we're just like but is she you know and it's kind of that weird cognitive dissonance that's happening throughout this entire book and we see that with Genevieve as well in her treatment um, with Grace in that scene.
yeah. And interesting about alcohol and the way that it's drunk as well, because it's another form of water,
Mhm.
and it is exerting influence on another character
Oh,
in a
that's
negative
I didn't
fashion.
even
So
notice
there,
that.
um,
Mm,
and that has Eleanor had some part to play in that? Probably not. You know, she probably said
yeah.
this woman sounds self-destructive anyway. But it is about her general nature, and I think that goes back to the point that I keep on making is the fact that Eleanor's general nature seems to be warm and motherly and maternal, whereas Genevieve's seems to be doesn't care about Grace, doesn't you know their attachment to Grace at that stage does she doesn't really care about her, and as you said, Eleanor mightn't either, but for outward appearance sake, she makes it look like she does, and therefore people will judge her both positively and negatively, the two
Hmm.
characters, because that again within their define stereotypical female roles within society, still within
Mhm.
that. So while the women sort of run the society, they are still very much confined to classic gender roles.
Mhm. I agree. I agree.
So yeah, very very interesting that part.
It is. Something I think was even more interesting is this whole scene with the jewelry. Like all of the
Mhm.
aftermath of like when Genevieve was lost, and like the whole thing is just so bizarre and weird, but also I think very socially significant as well,
Mhm.
like how this whole thing pans out. So I think this is actually probably one of my favorite scenes too, to see, what happened with the jewelry, like socially, what was the expectation, and then this whole like again weird like magical gothic creepy like scene where jewelry is falling from the ceiling or something like that. And then again the kind of erasure of that with Mary Love as well,
That's right.
because she got what she wanted, and she's like, oh well, they're bats, and sister's like, there's no bats, and like what are you talking about? It's like, it's bats, and she's kind of falling into this as well, into this dynamic. But I thought that I also think it's really interesting, her confrontation with James about what happened to the jewelry before it
Mhm.
was done. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, because I actually think that is very significant.
Um, yeah. So I mean, to me, the jewelry signifies. And correct me if I'm wrong here. In general, it's an outward sign of affection and worth t- for females within society, and for them. While there's a whole hoard of jewels here that's been kept, I think they're very representative of families that have been around for a long time. The kind of jewelry kind of gets passed down from generation to generation. The jewels actually are from the earth as well. So
Hmm.
diamonds, jade, whatever you want to talk about, pearls are all naturally occurring elements. So therefore, are belong to the earth in some way rather than to people. And then, as you say, Mary Love is bribed, for want of a better word, by the kind of the promise of this jewelry, because the only ones that Eleanor really cares about are the black pearls. Isn't that right?
Hmm. Yep.
So she that's and again those are the ones from the pearls are from the sea.
The sea.
That's
Yep.
the only
The
thing that,
water.
that she
Yep.
wants. So,
Hmm.
so this
But
idea
but
of,
they're also black pearls, which I think is
but they're
interesting.
also
They're
black.
not
Yeah,
like
yeah,
they're not the white pearls. They're kind of like that darker, mysterious, like grayish, like, yeah. So I think that's kind of interesting too.
yeah,
They're like
and don't have the
stormy in a way.
yeah, stormy. They're not pure, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
There is
right, right, right.
something that, of some of that. So, I mean, this idea that people um want the jewelry as a sign of kind of ownership or possession of something tangible other than just the jewel itself, if you know what I mean. I deserve this. I I've earned this in some way because of my status within society. And how ultimately I think when the jewelry is kind of making its way around the house in this kind of magical realism kind of way, it's like almost the jewels are being used to attack and kind of manipulate people very heavily within the story, especially, well, not especially the females, essentially, within the story, and how important that is to so many of them. Even Eleanor, she has her wants and needs, of those,
Hmm.
even though they're very specific, and how jewelry kind of smooths over all the rough edges, if you know what I mean, just like it
Yeah.
does in traditional hetero relationships in some ways. Oh, I've been, I've been a bad guy. Domestic abuse. Here's a lovely necklace for you. Okay, well, we'll give it another shot. These are
Oh my
very
God.
gender norm kind of things. I cheated on you. Here's a new ring or otherwise. It's like what are you talking about? But these are very classic things, almost like bribery, as I was saying,
Yeah.
in terms of like forgiving ills or trying to sway and create influence.
Yeah. I also think that the way it's done is almost like in a mocking way. You know what I mean? Like this, I think it was in the house that Mary Love was building for them, right?
Oscar and
And
Eleanor, yeah,
Oscar and Eleanor. And it's kind of like a no one's gonna believe you if you tell anybody. And it's almost like a mocking way. It's like, oh, you got what you want, but you got it my way. You know what I mean? It's a very like mocking, almost like power
yeah. Hmm.
dynamic there with like, well, if you tell anyone, they're gonna carry you off to the asylum, because who's gonna say like jewelry is falling from the sky in a bedroom? Like that doesn't sound right. Um much less that Eleanor got the jewelry before they did. So like it doesn't sound right. Like no one's going to believe this. And so I do think there was an element of mocking in how
Yeah.
that was done, which I think was really interesting. I also thought it was interesting that it almost symbolized like rain a little bit, like it's raining down. Again, another water element.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I never thought
Um,
about that.
so I think that that's a little like a tongue-in-cheek type of like, Eleanor-ism there. Like I think
Yeah.
the way that it was done was a little mocking. So
And also the parallel to then the possession of the baby as well. The two things that happen at the same time in the story, they're intrinsically linked. This idea, this is our baby. This is not yours.
yeah. Before we get to that, I actually
Yeah.
did have one more point
Okay,
with
go.
James
Yeah,
about
please.
that. Sorry, just because I don't want to forget. Um,
No, please.
I think it's interesting when even before we got the jewelry back, like this idea that James buried the jewelry with um the dead wife, and
Mhm.
Mary Love having to like spell this out for him and why that was a bad idea. I think this did two different things. I think number one, it kind of signified that James really actually doesn't care about like the social status or the history or anything. He doesn't, he's removed from that.
Mhm.
And he doesn't place value in that. But I also kind of see it as like a commentary of these like the gentleman in the story being very inept, and like not thinking things through and not realizing, well, I do have a young daughter that is going to grow up. Yeah, that's like almost $40,000 worth of jewelry back then, like, which is a lot of money now. Like, yeah, maybe she should have it. Like, it doesn't even occur to him. And I think it's incredibly interesting because this isn't a woman that we see him having like undying love for too. Like it
Mhm.
was,
That's right.
it wasn't he was it was somebody who was causing a little bit of shame for him and his family. She was gone, so it wasn't like I didn't get the impression that they were like super in love or anything like that.
Yeah.
And yet still it was like, no, she deserves that. And it takes Mary Love literally sitting him down and being like, think about this, like just think about that. And then you could see it like start to dawn and be like, oh. So I think this was kind of a way to show within the story that the men are a little not the brightest in
Yeah.
comparison to the women in the story. And I think that was a way to kind of show that he didn't think, and there's no reason for him not to think about this a little more critically. So I thought
Yeah.
that was quite interesting.
No, that is very much so. I didn't really think of it in that deep terms because you are right. There's no doubt. I think that both Oscar and James are both painted as not being on top of their game. Let's say in that way, they're not exerting their control over people within the story. In fact, both are sort of, and especially James to a certain extent, is seen as a bit of a dreamer.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, he seems like a nice person, a good person. Doesn't want anything fancy, just wants simple things and a good stable environment to go on. But the other part of it is, I mean, I can sort of, we're talking about at the start about how I can see the male point of view in that.
Mhm.
He would have, I can see him just going, but they weren't really mine. They were hers. They were
Mhm.
Genevieve's. So they should go with Genevieve. He isn't tied to the fact, nor does he really need the money because he has a house. He
Mhm.
has, that kind of stuff. He doesn't feel like he needs it. And that ownership of the jewelry is with his wife, he thinks. But another woman, and again, this threat of the other female,
Yeah.
will look at it and go, actually, they mean more than just kind of sentimental. Um, there's more than sentimental attachment to those rather than going on there, and you're missing something. And Mary Love's using the daughter, another
Yeah.
female, as a way to bribe or to
Mhm.
exert influence over James's decision making in that case. Which, again, the fact that this was written by a male, I think is really interesting because the men are the weak and
Yeah.
the kind of meek, and the easily played with, and the women are the really the people that run the world, so to speak.
Mhm.
So I think such an interesting part about the story. You've got all these themes and things that have been set up, that we still have like five novellas or five parts of the story still to go on, and you've got to imagine that lots of these will reappear
Yes.
further down the line, in terms of like the jewelry. This idea of even the black pearls has been that they will have some sort of significance to the story. You've got to imagine that kind of comes further on down the line when that happens. So Yeah, that was interesting for sure.
Yeah, totally. And so I think that was a very interesting scene. I love that scene.
Yeah. So about the baby.
The baby, which I think is what a way to end a story with this whole like
Mm.
baby like conundrum here. It's whoa, like
I don't really know how to approach this because I mean you could see it coming in the story.
yeah,
The author alludes to it, the fact that the Mary Love and the daughter kind of have this thing of like the star baby they're bringing up, etc.
yeah,
But the fact that it was so blatantly used as a negotiating ploy,
yeah, yeah.
um, as if and not only for approval, it was used for material. As if you were selling your child for a material thing. Um, and it's interesting how Eleanor responds to it and Oscar responds to it, and everybody sort of responds to it. I think that's the the bit that really ties together because it sort of assuages this idea that Eleanor is purely maternal in the way that she is seen to be
Mm,
shown towards Grace. If you know what I mean,
yeah,
that's not her child, whereas you would have expected the wrath to come
yep.
at this point, if that makes sense, rather than against the wife.
I almost wondered if the baby was even real because
Mm,
there's a scene where it's like, oh, she's the quietest baby. She'll be like smiling at like the caretakers. She's and I don't know if the baby's a boy or girl. I think it's a girl.
it's a girl. It's a girl.
It's a girl, yeah. Um, you know, the even she's like, oh, what do you want? Well, I want a girl. Well, a girl it shall be. Like, I don't even know if this baby's really even real. Um,
Yeah.
and the fact that when it was baptized, like the water turned strange. So it's not a real baptism in a way, or it
Mm,
is, but in an ancient way that we don't even understand, with Eleanor's type of whatever she is. So I almost thought that either the baby wasn't real or the baby's not going to stay along, not going to be
mm,
around very much, because we know
interesting.
that Eleanor can like, do that. And that kind of makes sense on why she doesn't have much of an attachment to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a real baby, but it's not a being in a way. It's not a human baby in a way that we would think about it. It's kind of like a animated reborn doll, if you've ever seen those, like something else. Just they're perceiving it to be like a baby human, but it's not. So
Yeah.
that's
It's
and that's
interesting
where that's
because
where I see like horror, where I'm like, ooh, like, and that's why it can be used to manipulate because it does seem like there's almost an intelligence there, like a little piece of Eleanor, which I know quite literally babies like fine. But I know that's like the whole point. But you know what I mean? Like something more advanced than a baby, like something else.
yeah. Well, I was going to say it does raise the question, and one that I had throughout the entire book, in fact, that Eleanor's probably not human either.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this kind of representation of a baby or a human in some ways is sort of consistent with Eleanor as a character, I think, because you know she can obviously take human form and maintain human form, but you get the sense that there's something much more primal and ancient about her than just that being simply a human.
Well, didn't we see the pastor or preacher like see her in the river and she like
Mm.
shifted or something like that
Shifted,
very
yeah,
early
yeah,
on?
yeah, yeah. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so he
like
had
so we already so that's again, we know like Eleanor's not really like Eleanor. You know what I mean? Like Eleanor is something else. And I think that's also where I'm getting that this baby isn't really a baby. It's something else, like I don't know. So, but
yeah,
but I do think it's just so interesting the entitlement that Mary Love and sister have over this kid. And
yeah.
as much as we were talking about like female roles in this society, like at first when Oscar says like, "Oh, I think you should give up a job." Well, I'm not giving up my job, and
Hmm.
like that's no, like I'm doing all of this. And then, once she's shamed for that too, then and it no longer serves her. It's like, well, no, I'm going to stay home. I'm quitting my job. And it's such a switch up. And it's kind of like she can never win, which I think is very interesting. And it's a very interesting commentary of that because that job was kind of what endeared her into the community. But now, like, in this fight, well, she's like, well, I'm going to say it. And it's like, well, you can't take care of the baby. Like, you can't do this. And it's like, wait a minute, where's all this coming from? Like,
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting. It's kind of this double-edged sword for her. So I thought that was interesting.
yeah, no, definitely. And yeah, so hopes and thoughts for book two.
Excuse me. I mean, I'm definitely interested in reading it. Like now I need to know. Now I need to know. But honestly, this kind of feels like a 1919 Southern Gothic like reality show at this point. And
Yeah,
I'm just in it for the drama, to be honest. I want to see what happens with Mary Love. I want to see what happens with Sister. I want to see what happens with Eleanor. Like I want to know like who else is like gonna start seeing through all of this stuff. I'm very invested in this now. I want to
yeah.
see if this baby like survives. So I'm very, very
Well, it is a
interested
baby.
to see what happens with this baby.
Yeah, I'm sort of dreading. I sort of don't want this to turn into Jaws town hall planning.
Yeah,
I don't want. I don't really care about the levy, to be honest. Even though it's
yeah,
obviously a central part of the story and literally the title of the next part of the book. Or other than that, I sort of don't want them all to be shouting and kind of in the thing. I want it to be a bit more nuanced to it than that. But like you say, the character development and the kind of development or non-development of the male characters within this story, I sort of feel like both James and Oscar are either unimportant to the story or irrelevant, which sort of makes them not have plot armor, if that
mm,
makes sense.
mm,
In some
mm,
ways, so if James
mm.
was to go and she became the mother of Grace, and actually, what would that do for her?
Yeah, that'd be
That
interesting.
kind of stuff that would be interesting. And obviously, the big threat to Eleanor is still Mary Love at this stage. So it, like I say, this kind of almost good versus evil kind of plan. But what happened in one book and five to go, essentially?
I also think we left in a time where I think Oscar is starting to realize that something's not right too. Because like the very last edge, he's like, wait a minute, she's using this baby as a pawn,
Yeah.
and that realization for him is probably very scary. But I
Mhm.
don't know if it's going to be another one of those rug sweep where it's like, yeah, maybe they can like raise my baby. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? You don't know. You don't know what is he going to like wake up and start like asking questions, or is he gonna just rug sweep and go along with this like we've seen him done to his what like we've seen him do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's
that
interesting.
I think was pretty interesting. I thought that revelation at the very end was
Yeah.
phenomenal. And that again, we see like Eleanor like doesn't have that. That's where I was like, is the baby even real? Because I'm like, I would think that any mother like who has a maternal instinct would like fight tooth and nail instead of being like,
Well,
okay, like, yeah, we'll go next door, like let pack up and not leave the baby. That's why I'm like, I don't think the baby is real because she doesn't have an attachment to it.
yeah. But and she literally killed the mother of the child that wasn't hers. So it
Yeah,
shouldn't have a threat, which again says it's not probably about Gracie at all at that
yeah,
stage, you know. So yeah, interesting. You eager to
yeah.
read on, absolutely. And it definitely fits with the heat wave that we're having here at the moment as well. I definitely
Oh my gosh, it's so bad.
I'm sitting in a puddle here in my room here at the moment, and I have been for days. It has not been pleasant, but yeah, good fun.
Well,
And we'll see if we can reconvene for part two, indeed, at some stage in the
sounds
future.
good. Yeah, I'm
If
in.
people want, if people want to find you, Jane, where would they find you?
Yep. So I am Lady Jane at Lady Jane Books. I am a reader who does more like horror, thriller, spooky stuff. And yeah, and I do wonderful book discussions as well. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, give a follow on Instagram as well. It's Lily Jane Books on Instagram as
yep,
well, isn't it?
same
Yeah.
one, Lady Jane Books.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. So we look forward to catching up for book two, and you can also, as you say, there are lots of other discussions over on Jane's book channel as well. Just give it a watch, give it a follow, and feedback and see what kind of interesting things she gets up to there. Thanks everybody if you've made it this far, and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.